Hello, good morning everybody. I hope this is going out fine. If someone could let me know this is working. I've had another Facebook uh, change in system today, so I just want to be sure that you can see me. Um, my name is Lorna. I am the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service, and welcome to the 77th Learn with Lorna, a series that we started at the beginning of lockdown in 2020 to share some of our collections while we were not able to have people in the building, and then which has just grown and grown and grown, and we're still here a year and a half later. So um, this is what the series is about. So this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. There's a link to be able to do so in the body of the text, both here on Facebook and also subsequently when this is broadcast on YouTube. This week we are continuing our theme of looking at life stories. Last week we were in the mid to late 20th century to look at the story of Jane Durham. This week we are in the late 1600s and the early 1700s to look at the life of Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, Mac Shimmy More, as he was known to the clan. Entirely different character from Jane Durham last week. One thing they have in common is that we hold collections relating to them and written by them. That should give you an idea of how diverse my job is, but I'm sure that you'll be familiar with that by now after this year and a half of different subjects, how very diverse the collections are that we hold. Now, perhaps more than any other person that I have talked about in this series, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, is a complex person at the head of Clan Fraser, at the centre of the Jacobite risings in various ways. He was a real character, which is testified to by his nicknames of the time: the Old Fox, the Great Leviathan, the Monster. He is someone who brings out a huge amount of passion in people, one way or the other. There are a lot of people who are passionately interested in Lovat's life, and people who certainly at the time and subsequently have despised him. And we'll talk about that as we go through. So as I say, he's a real character. The Dictionary of National Biography called him a notorious Jacobite intriguer. And the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, which holds a copy of this famous Hogarth etching of Lovat, they described him like this: the chief of Clan Fraser, Simon Fraser, 11th Lord Lovat, switched his support to and fro between the Jacobites and the government throughout his long life. Spectacularly unprincipled and guided solely by self-interest, this charming bigamist convinced everyone, from Louis XIV and Mary of Modena to William of Orange and George I. So you can see there how the common theme that comes across there is self-interest and switching sides. So as I say, there are many varying opinions of him. Some see him as patriotic, last real clan chief who was responsible for keeping the Frasers of Lovat line in prominence, and others see him as a bigamous traitor. Depends on the time period, it depends on the politics and people's standpoint. And so I go into it this week being well aware that this is a subject that people may well have strong feelings on. But some of the facts are indisputable. Simon Fraser is believed to have been born in around about 1667, 1678. That's not known for certain, but it's the best estimate using his age at his death and comments that he made during his lifetime. His father was Thomas Fraser, who would become Thomas Fraser of Beaufort, and his mother was Sibylla MacLeod, who was a daughter of MacLeod of MacLeod. It's likely that he was born in Urry, at or near Castle Downey, so in Fraser Heartland. He was from an important line of Frasers, but not directly in line to inherit the title and become Fraser clan chief, and that's important. He was not the oldest son of his father, and his father was also not the oldest son. So several stages removed from the direct line of to inherit the title of Lovat. And it was only through the early deaths of several family members that he found himself as clan chief. Simon Fraser was educated at King's College in Aberdeen, which had existed since, or has existed since 1495, and it would appear that he had a particular skill for language, according to various biographers. This extract I'm going to share with you is from The Lives of Lord Lovat and Duncan Forbes by John Hill Burton. And it reads, his biographers say that he made great and rapid progress in his studies. This is invariably said in the biographical dictionaries of scholars and philosophers. It is not so frequent an attribute of men whose subsequent history is such as we are about to report. Yet one can easily believe that Simon, with his brain ever at work and his ambition ever on the stretch, would let no one outstrip him. When it suited him to deal in the lofty and magnanimous, he was prompt with scraps from the Latin classics. His subsequent full and free use of French indicates an aptitude for languages seldom equalled, and his tone of writing and speaking was that of a scholar, always when he thought fit that it should be so. So an understanding there of him having an ability and an affinity with languages, but also that reference there to his brain being constantly on the move to assess what might be required of him at any given moment. Now, in the course of this talk, I'm going to refer to various aspects of the Jacobite risings. It is a complicated political picture. If you're not overly au fait with the subject, then it might be worth going back and having a look at the Learn with Lornas that I've done specifically on the Jacobite risings. That will give some background on the subject. But in 1688, the Glorious Revolution took place. This was the event that removed the Catholic King James VII and II from the throne and replaced him with his Protestant daughter and son-in-law, William and Mary. Supporters of the exiled King James and his subsequently his son and grandson were known as the Jacobites. That becomes relevant, so that's all happening during his early life. From Aberdeen, Simon Fraser was called into the service of Lord Murray, who would go on to become the Duke of Atholl, Earl of Tullibardine, and Lovat's great enemy. This period of his life, serving alongside Lord Murray, would result in a circuitous kind of way in him eventually gaining the title Lord Lovat, but it would also result in some of the episodes for which he became notorious. The attempted abduction of Amelia Fraser, and the forced marriage of her mother, also Amelia, his cousin, all to secure the title and the succession. I was going to try and put it into words to explain it to you myself, but I think the best thing is if I read you this extract, which is from the Dictionary of National Biography, which records this episode in Lovat's life, although he wasn't Lovat at the time. So he was asked, his studies were interrupted by the proposal that he should accept a commission in the regiment of Lord Murray, afterwards Duke of Atholl. The proposal was, he states, extremely distasteful to him, and only assented to on the assurance that the design of Lord Murray in accepting the regiment was treacherously to aid King James with it. So he is joining a government regiment, but because he says he hopes that the aim of that regiment is to secretly support the exiled Stuart monarchs. In 1696, he accompanied Lord Murray, who in July was created Earl of Tullibardine, and his cousin Lord Lovat to London. He there so ingratiated himself with his cousin that Lord Lovat made a bequest to him that all his estates, in case he should die without male issue, an opportune arrangement, for Lovat died very shortly after his return from London. But by a deed made on the 20th of March, it was found that the estates had already been settled for life on Simon Fraser's father, Thomas Fraser of Beaufort. So he worked on his cousin while they were away to try and gain his trust, gain that transfer of the estates into his name. But the estates went to his father. So that was fine. The father assumed the title of Lord Lovat, and Simon styled himself Master of Lovat. Amelia, eldest daughter of the 10th Lord, assumed, however, the title of Baroness of Lovat, and as she had the support of her mother's brother, the Earl of Tullibardine, he prudently resolved to end the dispute by marrying the heiress. So there are various claims now to the Lovat line. Lord Lovat, as he would become our Lord Lovat, Simon Fraser, had tried to ingratiate himself enough to get the line given to him, but it had also been claimed by a different descendant, a female. And so Lovat's way of dealing with this situation is to try and marry the heiress and therefore secure that succession. He attempted to get her into his hands, but the clansman who had been entrusted with conveying her for whatever reason failed to complete his commission and brought her back to his mother. So he couldn't succeed in abducting the young Amelia, and so instead, he says, he then invested Castle Downey, of which he soon obtained possession, and finding that the daughter had been removed beyond his reach, resolved, possibly from a rather sudden impulse of vengeance rather than interested motives, to compel the mother to marry him instead. So he's been unsuccessful in trying to abduct the young heiress, and so instead he decides that he will take the mother as his wife instead. In the middle of the night, he introduced into her chamber a clergyman, Robert Munro of Abertarf, and the marriage was performed by force, bagpipes being blown to stifle the lady's cries. For some time afterwards, the lady, who he also removed to the island of Aegis, remained in a state of utter physical and mental prostration, but Fraser is said to have ultimately won her affection. And that's mentioned in several sources, that although this appears to have been a forced marriage, that she did eventually come to have some affection for him. Because this had been a forced marriage, her brother was so infuriated that he at once took measures for punishing the outrage committed on his sister. Letters of intercommuning and of fire and sword were issued against Fraser and his followers. Proceedings were taken against him and his father in the courts of justiciary, which ended on the 6th of September 1698, in their being found guilty of high treason and condemned to be executed as traitors. Simon removed his father to Skye, where he died in the castle of Dunvegan in 1699, and the son assumed the title of Lord Lovat. So, as I say, it's a complex picture. There's a lot of strands of the family. But the gist of that is that he is very, very keen to secure the line and in whatever way he can. And the fact that this forced marriage is performed infuriates the woman's family, who then try to take him to court for it. A dramatic story. And Simon Fraser would go on to persistently deny this, and he would go on to marry another 2 times without officially ending that marriage, which eventually he just said had been, when it no longer suited him, he said had been a practical joke. He would, as I say, continually go on to deny it, but the definitive book, The History of the Frasers of Lovat, a huge book about the Frasers by Alexander Mackenzie, notes that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Now, as that entry concluded, for this act and for raising arms, both he and his father were tried in absentia for high treason, so they didn't go to the court, but they were tried for high treason. They were outlawed and sentenced to death, which Simon Fraser initially evaded by travelling around the Highlands with a group of loyal followers. And it's a real skill of his that you see right throughout his life, that he always is able to generate loyal followers. In 1699, as that extract said, Simon's father died at Dunvegan Castle and Simon became Lord Lovat, although because he was technically an outlaw because of these crimes, he couldn't officially claim the estate at that point. Now, in 1701, he enlisted the aid of the Duke of Argyll to help him get a pardon from King William III, which he did. A comprehensive pardon for all his crimes against the state, but not the crimes against the Dowager Lady Lovat, so not against the lady that he had forcibly married, because that was a personal crime and not a crime against the state. The pardon didn't cover it. So he was again called to court to face charges of what he had done to Amelia, but he failed to appear in court. Several reasons why have been suggested, and so he was again outlawed. Following the deaths of William and Mary, the throne passed to Mary's sister Anne. She again was also a Protestant, and by this point Lovat felt that it was probably wise to step back for a while, retreat from being so kind of centre of public awareness. And so he made his way through the country and across to France to the exiled court of King James. So as I said at the Glorious Revolution, King James the Seventh and Second has been exiled from England. He had gone to France while the throne was taken over, and so Lovat at this point goes to France to try and ingratiate himself with the exiled court. By this point, King James VII and II has died, but his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, is the next claimant. The result of this was that two things. Lovat went to France and spent his time there ingratiating himself with the court, converting to Catholicism, which strengthened his links to the exiled Stuarts. He assured them of his loyalty to the Jacobite cause. The other thing that happened back at home was that Alexander Mackenzie, who had married the young girl that Lovat had tried to abduct, was all set by this point to take over the Lovat estates and line. The Frasers were under pressure on all sides, and now the Fraser clan was set to be managed and run and led by a Mackenzie, which was unpopular. So these two things, that's happening at home. The Mackenzies are gradually gathering strength. That link to the clan is weakening, and Lovat is in France ingratiating himself with the Jacobite cause. Now, while he's in France, as I say, he converted to Catholicism. He also assured the Jacobite court of his loyalty and suggested to them that they invaded, that there was a Jacobite invasion supported in huge numbers by the French, invading Britain. A very detailed plan which he planned, which was later put into execution to some extent. He returned in Scotland. He managed to gather support for this in France, and so he returned to Scotland in 1703 with the aim of assessing support for a Jacobite invasion. Now, in classic Lovat style, he did tour the Highlands, questioning whether there was support for the rising, but he found that support was quite lukewarm for a variety of reasons, not least financial. So when he found that the support for the Jacobite rising wasn't that strong, the other thing he did was went to Queen Anne's Protestant court and told them that the French were planning an invasion. And you get this sense right through his life of covering his back all the time, hedging his bets between the sides. And so, although he was the one who had suggested that there could be an invasion, he then went and said to Queen Anne's court, just so you know, the French are planning to invade. When he did that, he implicated his own personal political enemy, the Duke of Atholl, and the aim of this all was to regain his reputation, get access to his estates and title before the clan became overly comfortable with Mackenzie at the head. In the book Lives of Lord Lovat and Duncan Forbes, Hill Burton noted that Lovat was constantly juggling a variety of parties to keep them on side. He was negotiating with the Jacobites in France, the Jacobites in Scotland, the Duke of Queensberry, who was Queen Anne's representative in Scotland, Secretary of State for Scotland. And so it's that constant assessing where he's at, what people need to hear from him. So he's come to Scotland, he has assessed, tried to rally support for the Jacobite cause, found that there wasn't much, and then has leaked the news of the plans to the opposing side. On returning to France, he went back to France and found that the news of his double crossing was known there. And so the French captured him and held him for 10 years, part of it in prison, part of it just in confinement, not within a prison, but still under being watched. So 10 years he spent in that situation. Now, in 1714, as you will maybe know from previous Learn with Lornas if you've watched my ones about the Jacobites, Queen Anne died in 1714 without leaving an heir, and the question of the succession of who the throne of Britain should go to was at its most critical since the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89. This was the point where there was a huge expectation that the throne could go back to the Stuart line, that it would go to that exiled court, but instead it went to the Protestant line, to a distant cousin to King George I. And so this is where there was a huge uprising of emotion about the future of the throne. Now, that's what was happening at a national level, but also at the same time, the Fraser clan are growing more and more frustrated at the fact that they're being led by a Mackenzie and that the person they see as their clan chief is not leading them. And all of this happened concurrently and brought matters to a head. Now, Major Fraser of Castle Leathers, I thought I would show this image to you because compared to the black and white Hogarth etching of Lord Lovat, this is Major Fraser of Castle Leathers. Quite a striking picture. He was a Hanoverian supporter, a supporter of the Protestant government, and he was dispatched to go to France to help Lovat escape and bring him back to lead the clan. Now, of course, Lovat saw this as an opportunity to get on the good side of the Hanoverian government. He's annoyed the Jacobite court in exile, so he comes back and thinks, well, maybe this is a moment I can get on the Hanoverian side instead. His main aim being to get back to his estates and his title. And so that is why in the 1715 Jacobite rising, the Frasers were raised on the government side, causing substantial damage to the Jacobite cause. They both sides knew that Lovat was such a gregarious man, such a prominent, high-profile man, that it was in everybody's interests really to have him on side, because by having him on side, you would have the Frasers on side, and also that very high profile of a well-known clan chief on side. And so the fact that in the 15 rising he brought the Frasers out on the government side caused a large amount of damage to the Jacobite cause. Lovat himself was central to the collapse of the 1715 Jacobite rising in Inverness. A letter which I have referred to before in previous episodes, which describes the death of Arthur Rose, includes a description of Lovat's triumphant return north. It said that he stunned the friends of the government into action, and the collapse of the Jacobite support in Inverness was largely down to Lovat and Duncan Forbes. The Jacobite garrison which had taken over Inverness deserted the town and left it to be possessed by Lovat and his supporters. On this occasion, his gamble of which side to support worked, because for his services to the government he was granted a full pardon for all previous offences. And his rival for the title, for the clan title, Mackenzie, who had, as I say, had been kind of stepping in while Lovat had been away, his rival, he had come out in support of the Jacobites, and so that meant that as Lovat went the right way, Mackenzie went the wrong way in the eyes of officialdom. And so this meant that he was able at this point to come back into the possession of the Lovat title and the estates, although that was a long drawn out legal process, not concluded until the 1730s. But this was the moment that he was able to regain that because of effectively backing the right horse at the right time. He was given official government roles such as command of a military company, an important role in Inverness as well. It's generally accepted, however, that his heart was probably always on the Jacobite side. He probably leant towards believing, as much as he did in anything, in the Jacobite cause. But what comes out above everything else is that always at the top of his priority list is supporting whatever personal gain or goal he was pursuing at any given time. And he would work on whoever could help him get to that end. Now, in our Lochaber Archive Centre, we hold many letters from Lovat to Lochiel. I've spoken before about the Camerons of Lochiel. We hold a lot of letters written by Lord Lovat to Lochiel in the 1730s and 1740s, and his character comes across very strongly in them, particularly his flattery, his complete skill of flattering whoever he's speaking to, and also the constant unease of clan relationships at the time comes across. It's very apparent that this is not just a case of clans versus government, as it's sometimes seen. The Jacobite risings are sometimes seen as all the Highland clans up in arms against a government. That's not the case. You very much see clan unease in these letters. So this is a letter that we hold in Lochaber, written in 1742 by Lord Lovat to Donald Cameron of Lochiel. Listen for the flattery. He says, I never longed so much to hear from any mistress that I've ever had as I have longed to hear from you since you went from this place. I hope this letter will find you in perfect health, and that my dear cousin the Lady Lochiel is well recovered, and that my dear little cousins, your children, are in good health. You may truly believe me when I tell you that I wish your health and your lady and children as well as I do my own and my children's health. So you may be sure that I was anxious and uneasy in so long without hearing from you, considering the tender condition that you left your lady in. If you are still in Lochgar, I beg that you do me the honour to assure me, my dear Sir James, your worthy father-in-law, that he has no relation in Scotland has a greater regard for him and his person and his merit than I have. I make the most humble compliments to him and his lady and his family. Your cousin Clooney has been here these 3 weeks past, and I do assure you that I am obliged to suffer a great many battles for him. Now this letter has come when Lovat is trying to marry his daughter into to Macpherson of Clooney. The Macintoshes, who are madly angry at this match, endeavour to get all those they converse with to cry out against me for making of it, and those who don't love that the Macphersons should be greater than they are, or that my family should be stronger than it is, make it their business to cry out against it. So there's an opposition there to that marriage because it will create an even stronger clan alliance between the Macphersons and the Frasers, and that's causing upset to the Macintoshes. So you can see this constant jostling for power, for authority, but also that huge amount of flattery that I've never longed to hear from a mistress as much as I've longed to hear from you. And that's very, very common in Lovat's letters, whoever he's writing to. But sometimes even Lochiel got on the wrong side of Lovat, as this letter shows. This is a letter from 1736, and it's to do with the Camerons stealing his cattle. And he says, I send 2 principal gentlemen of my name that are bailies and chamberlains and are well known to you, Alexander Fraser and William Fraser, to get your final and positive answer, war or peace, which will determine me. So he's saying, tell me the truth about whether your people have stolen my cattle or not. What you tell me will determine whether the Camerons and the Frasers are at war or at peace with each other. I have borne patiently all these affronts till now, in the hopes that the Laird of Lochiel, my near relation and my good friend, would give me redress, and that the clan of the Camerons would not willingly and wilfully make war against the clan of the Frasers, their old friends and allies, who fought their battles against the MacDonalds and the Macintoshes. I am very sure that your father and grandfather would be very averse to such a war with a kindred that they loved as much as any in the Highlands. So again, that just that sight of the turmoil of the time, both nationally and locally. Now, it's very clear throughout the correspondence which side Lovat's heart was on, particularly by the 1730s onwards. He's again back in correspondence with the Jacobite side. He was under government surveillance, though, because by this point hardly anyone in authority on any side fully trusts him. Everyone's just going, where are you going to go next? And so the government were removing his official government roles. In 1737, he was one of a group to propose another Jacobite rising. He promised support to the Jacobite cause in exchange for dukedom. He had offered already to support the government side, and King George had offered to be godfather to his child, but it appears that that offer of being godfather wasn't enough to retain his support, so he went to the Jacobite side effectively to see what they could offer, and they offered a dukedom. One of the letters in Lochaber illustrates his feelings on this. This is a letter written in 1743 by Lovat to Lochiel, and he says, I am fully persuaded by experience as much as you can be, that in this government there is no regard paid to past services, though never so essential. And for making new schemes, I'm too old for that. And though I should both resolve and lay myself out to do essential service to the family of Hanover, I must come short of what I have done already. For I helped to keep the crown on their head, and the returns I met with were barbarous and ungrateful usage. It has been my fate to be ill-used by courts, except by the glorious court of France. So again, it depends entirely on what's happening at the time and what he's trying to get out of it, as to who he's saying are the wonderful people and who he's saying are the terrible people who never support him. Now, when we came to the 1745 rising, of course, Lovat expressed tentative loyalty to both sides. So he came out in support of the Hanoverians and he came out in support of the Jacobites. Bonnie Prince Charlie offered him command of the Jacobite forces, but Lovat wasn't convinced that this rising was going to succeed, particularly because he felt when Bonnie Prince Charlie landed, he had not brought enough support, he hadn't brought enough weapons or men, and Lovat felt that it wasn't going to succeed. So instead what he did was something very clever, and you'll know, I'm sure if you know your Scottish history at all, that many families put someone on each side of the Jacobite risings to hedge their bets as to which way it might go. What Lovat did was he instructed his son, who apparently didn't want to, but instructed his son that he would join the Jacobite forces, and Lovat would stay at home saying out loud that he didn't approve of his son's choice to join the Jacobites. So again, just that hedging of bets of where it might go. After the disastrous Battle of Culloden, disastrous from a Jacobite perspective, Bonnie Prince Charlie met with him, and Lovat urged him to make one last stand, but in the end they both fled. Bonnie Prince Charlie, of course, went to the west to Skye, and Lovat hid on an island in Loch Morar, and Castle Downey, the family home which would become Beaufort Castle, was set ablaze by government forces. Lovat, by this point, was in his late 70s. He was very infirm. He was carried mostly on a litter, I don't know how else to describe a litter, like almost like a sedan chair. So he was carried. And so even though he was in this weak state, he was at this late age, and he was not very well, he hid in a hollow tree on an island in Loch Morar. Now, he was discovered by government troops. He had believed that he had the only way onto the island, but he was captured by government troops, found hiding in a hollow tree. Apparently it was his trousers being visible that gave him away. And he was transported to the Tower of London to appear in front of the courts, again for high treason. And it was during this journey down to the Tower of London, while passing through St Albans, that he met William Hogarth, who produced this etching. There were thousands of copies of it produced. Immediately it was a bestseller because, of course, he's so well known, and he's so well known on every side of the political divide. He has hugely loyal followers within Fraserism and elsewhere, and he has huge detractors, and so he's just an incredibly well-known person. If you can see there, he's counting on his fingers. We're not entirely sure why. It's possible that he was counting the number of clans that had come out in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie. We're not sure. But have it, if you just type into a search engine that Lord Lovat etching, you'll be able to see it. The trial of Lovat lasted 7 days, and at the end of which he was found guilty. He was sentenced initially to being beheaded and drawn and quartered, but in the end that was that sentence was reduced to beheading. Lovat's execution took place on the 9th of April 1747. It drew an enormous crowd, and it was the last public beheading in Britain. There were so many people in attendance at his execution that one of the stands collapsed, killing several people who were watching and leading Lovat to laugh and say, "The more mischief, the better sport." It's believed that that is the origin of the phrase, to laugh your head off. His final words on the stand before he was executed included Horace's phrase, "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori." It is sweet and seemly to die for one's country. He maintained to the end that all he had done was served his country. We hold a copy of a letter in Lochaber Archive Centre by John Gibson in London, which refers to the execution of Lovat. He talks about the huge numbers of people who are aiming to come and see the execution, and the fact that it is a miserable and raining day, which might put some off, but it didn't in the end. He says in his letter, "Although this old man be highly guilty, and his guilt inexcusable, yet a spectator cannot but be led to pity and bewail the corruption and infatuation of human nature. Lovat was executed and was buried at the Tower of London. Now, the family story for many years, for hundreds of years, was that the body had been exhumed, had been brought and buried at Wardlaw Mausoleum in the Fraser family crypt. That was disproved in an absolutely fascinating project by the University of Dundee. Professor Sue Black, who many of you will know of, did a forensic examination on the remains in the coffin at Wardlaw Mausoleum, which turned out instead to be a young woman. So the belief still is that the body is still in the Tower of London, but it's again just another extraordinary aspect to his life, that there was this legend about the body. It turned out not to be true. Who's the woman in the coffin? So yes, so he was executed. The Lovat estates were forfeited, and the title was forfeited as well. The estate was returned to his son in 1774 because he served very efficiently in the military on behalf of the government. And the titles of Lord Lovat wasn't returned until 1854. Now, I'm aware that I have run slightly over in time, but I do want to finish by reading an extract to you because I think it is just extraordinary. We work a lot with Lovat in our job. We talk a lot about Lovat's life, and one thing that comes across is just this endless, twisting, changing story, changing sides, changing perspectives, the fawning nature of his letters, basically sucking up to whoever he needs at the time to support him. And so I wanted to finish by reading this extract to you from a pamphlet published in 1746. Graphical contemporary account of his life, written by somebody who knew him personally. There's a whole long description. I'm not going to read it all, but I wanted to share some extracts with you. And it says, it's written like this. Lovat is a man of some share of learning and of great parts and abilities of mind. His universal experience and great attention to political matters have made him acquainted with men as well as with books. He is polite, affable, and agreeable in conversation, and so great a master of flattery and dissimulation that he generally pleases and gains the goodwill, if not the esteem, of those he converses with, however prejudiced and prepossessed they might have been against him. His knowledge of the history and genealogy of all the great families in Scotland contributes not a little to this, for there is no person in the country that he will not make out to be some relation or ally of a noble family or a descendant of some virtuous and illustrious hero. And you see that in his letters. My cousin, my friend, my supporter. And you can see him playing on that. In traditional history, he pays little regard to truth, provided he can give his story the air of probability. He seems to entertain his guests with the utmost cheerfulness and hospitality, but being sordidly avaricious, he grumbles privately at the least expense, and though to their faces he caresses them, no sooner do they turn their backs than he pronounces curses against them for the trouble and charge they've put him to. He is ambitious and proud, but when it serves his turn, he is cringing, mean, and fawning. He is crafty and subtle, but at times open and unguarded in his speeches and actions, and even in matters of great concern. By this means he has frequently involved himself in dangers and difficulties, but he is very fertile in expedients, and has almost always hitherto been successful in extricating himself out of any scrapes. His restless and active disposition conduces not a little to draw him into snares, but a ready invention and a bold and speedy execution helps him back out of them. In business he is unjust and unconscionable, and avows that his own profit or pleasure has always been the rule of his actions, and to that he has on all occasions sacrificed every other consideration. This has led him to violence, rape, cruelty, revenge, treachery, and every base and infamous practice when it suited his purpose. This has made him put himself into all shapes and appearances, and therefore rendered him detested and despised by good and virtuous men, dreaded by some, scorned and derided by others. He is naturally brave and resolute, and though to invisible powers he is fearful and timid. And then it concludes. So you get that feeling of the huge variety of his personality, and the fact that although there's a lot of negative about him, people still really like him. They can't help being drawn to him. And this little biography of him concludes with these words: "With regard to his lordship, I think his present conduct can hardly be accounted for in any other way than by supposing that it proceeded from a deliberate and malignant purpose to ruin and subvert our present government, merely because that government has not thought fit to gratify his ambitions, passions, and desires." I love that. Someone else said that there's no consistent theme in Lovat's life other than self-interest. But yes, an extraordinary character. I'm sure you agree. Really fascinating, loved and revered by many as the last great Highland chief, hated by many as a traitor and a spy. So thank you, Anne. I'm glad that you feel it was well explained. I was very conscious that it's a complicated story, so I'm glad that came across like that. If you want to learn more, then just look him up online. There's all sorts of information. Clan Fraser have a website which details his life, and particularly I would recommend The Last Highlander, a book written by Sarah Fraser, and that's a particularly interesting book and an account of him. Very, very detailed research. I'm just seeing the question. I think he was given the position of Governor of the Castle of Inverness. So yes, I hope you enjoyed that. I'm sorry I ran over a little bit. It's impossible not to when you're talking about Lovat. There's just so many twists and turns. I hope you can join me next week. Next week we'll be looking at some more stories related to mental health and our asylum records. I hope you can join me for that, to find out some different aspects of some people's life stories. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very, very grateful for that. Thank you.